What procedures did you undergo and how old were you? Let's start with that.
When I was 12 years old, I had a puberty blocker implant placed in my left arm. And when I was 13 years old, I was put on testosterone, which I continued until about earlier this year. But the last couple years of being on testosterone, I was kind of on and off. And then when I was about 14 years old, I had a double mastectomy.
All right, so let's go back before you were 12. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's a reason that you were put on puberty blockers at 12.
Right.
How did you come to be put on them? So I guess that means, how did you come in contact with Dr. Joanna Olson Kennedy?
Yeah.
How did you come in contact with this therapist, Susan Landon? And why? So you can go back as early as you want, detailing out your childhood and early adolescence. Tell us what brought you to the physicians and the counselor, or the psychologist counselor first.
Right. Yeah. So just to give enough context, when I was about 6 years old, I was sexually abused. And that was something I had never even dealt with or talked about until much, much later on. So by the time that I was approaching puberty, around 11 years old, I think I started going through puberty, I started just feeling terrible, terrible anxiety about my body and about the idea of becoming a woman. And I felt really, really isolated from my female peers because I had really a different perspective on puberty and what it meant to be a woman because of what happened to me when I was really young.
Okay,
so,
can you detail to the degree that you're willing to or capable of what happened to you when you were 6?
Yeah, so I was sexually abused by an older classmate. He was about 4 years older than me, and it went on for about a year. So it was pretty intense. And in my brain, I just sort of processed it as something I didn't need to think about. So I never really dealt with that until later.
Okay, can you... that's a typical response for a child, but it isn't exactly so much as that you might say that you don't need to think about it. Yeah. It's really that you can't.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, part of what happens to kids if they're hurt, and this is worse the younger they are, let's say, is that they don't have any framework of reference or any philosophical tools to understand what happened, and certainly not why. They don't understand the motivation of the perpetrator. They don't understand their own vulnerability. They don't understand the failures of the systems that were designed to protect them. They don't have anybody to talk to. And so there's actually no way of processing that. Right. It's not only a matter of whatever avoidance there might have been on your part. It's that it's not really possible.
Yeah.
What details of the abuse are you willing to share? And now there's a reason I'm asking you that is because I want to know as much as you can. Tell me, I want to know how severe what happened to you was, how long it lasted. And the reason I want to know that is because I want to understand why it was that you became apprehensive when puberty hit. Okay, so you can tell as much of the story as necessary to explain your anxiety as far as you're concerned.
Yeah, so just to put it bluntly, I was raped multiple times. So when I was coming to 11, 12, and I started learning about sex ed and figuring out what sex was, I sort of started to unpack what had happened to me. And that was fully sort of when I was able to understand what actually happened.
Yeah, okay. So, there were early psychoanalytic theories about anorexia, for example, and one of the theories, and I'm not vouching for the validity of this theory, but it's an interesting approach, and I think sometimes it's valid, is that some of the impetus for anorexia for some women, for some girls, particularly those who were sexually abused, was the attempt to forestall puberty.
Yeah.
And because of apprehension around the emergence of sexual capability, let's say, and also the possibility of sexual predation. And you can imagine just generally that it is perfectly reasonable for young women to be apprehensive about puberty because new dangers emerge. Now, there's actually a biological response to that, so I don't know if your therapists told you this or your physicians, but it's necessary to know. So boys and girls under the age of puberty don't differ much in their proclivity for negative emotion, anxiety and depression. Okay, at puberty, that changes. And this is cross-culturally stable, and it's mostly biological. And we know that because the differences are most pronounced in gender equal societies. Right, okay. Women become more anxious and depressed than men, more sensitive to negative emotion at puberty, and that never goes away.
Yeah.
And so then you might ask why? Well, sexual vulnerability makes the world a dangerous place for women. Then you might say, well, women also have to take care of infants, so being threat sensitive is reasonable because they're going to be more sensitive to dangers to their baby, but they also become sexually vulnerable, right? And their boys and men become physically much more powerful than women at that point too. So it appears as though what nature does to address that imbalance is increase the negative emotion that women feel. That happens at puberty. Okay. But there's one more twist to that. And I'd like to know if any of this was explained to you, because it should have been. The typical pattern that negative emotion takes in young women is bodily concern. And it's partly because women are evaluated for better or worse in consequence of their physical appearance. And so it's very commonly the case that if a woman is anxious and depressed, is experiencing high levels of negative emotion, that expresses itself as hyper concern about bodily appearance.
Right.
Now, when you were brought, when you were little, maybe you don't remember even, but how much of that was explained to you?
None of that was explained.
Okay, so one of the things I'd like to point out to everyone watching is there's no excuse for not explaining this. If you're a physician who's trained well enough to dare to meddle in someone's gender identity, and if you're a counselor who's counseling someone who hypothetically has gender dysphoria, especially someone female, then these are elementary facts. The first thing you do when you deal with someone who is anxious and depressed when they're female and they're entering puberty is to explain this. It's psychology. I wouldn't call it 101. It's developmental psychology 101. And so that's minimum necessary information. Now, there's a reason that should be explained to you, you know. So it's very frequently the case that people who are having psychological trouble, so excess anxiety and depression, let's say, they feel like they're the only people who are in that boat. So they feel isolated and alone and sort of singled out. And part of the reason you explain the prevalence of a given diagnosis even to someone is to say, you're not alone. This isn't unique to you. In fact, it's quite common. These are the symptoms that are commonly associated with it. These are the reasons for the symptoms. And, well, in the case of the symptoms that you describe, the typical pattern is that even adolescents who are radically gender dysphoric adapt by the time they're 18.
Yeah.
At least 80% of them. This has been known for, well, I'd say 4 decades, 5 decades. It's been known a long time. It's been replicated many times. It's a very stable finding. So the reliable clinicians and physicians have concluded, especially before all of this got politicized, that if a child is severely gender dysphoric, the best thing to do is nothing until they're 18. Most of them are, what would you say, reconciled to their fate by that point. And that's also not that atypical because puberty throws a monkey wrench into everyone's works.
Yeah.
Now, you were at particular risk for that, and you said why.